Hey everyone, Puneet here. Welcome to episode 5 of the North of Patient podcast, Conversations on Health Beyond Care. So this week, I'm excited to introduce my guest, Ken Liu. Ken is an award-winning American author known for his speculative fiction. He's the creative mind behind the Dandelion Dynasty, a silkpunk epic fantasy series that kicks off with the Grace of Kings. Note, Ken is actually credited with coining the term silkpunk, which I define in the episode blog. Before he was a full-time writer, Ken did everything from software engineering to corporate law. On top of this, he's a sought-after thought leader on topics ranging from futurism and machine-augmented creativity to the history of technology to bookmaking and even the mathematics of origami. So the question is, how does Ken fit into a healthcare podcast? Well, it all started when I came across his short story called Good Stories, which delves into the role of creativity in an AI-dominated world and touches on the yearning for human-generated art. This story sparked my thoughts on the future of empathy in the context of healthcare, particularly in terms of AI-generated empathy versus the empathy by human clinicians, which I've discussed in another blog post. I was genuinely thrilled when Ken agreed to come onto the podcast, and our conversation did not disappoint. It definitely took a philosophical turn as we explored topics at the intersection of AI and the human condition. Ken's insights are a powerful reminder that as we weave more AI into healthcare, we need to ensure these technologies bolster our human values and enhance care outcomes. It's not just about incorporating more technology. This episode is essential for anyone keen on the future intersections of technology, storytelling, and human-centered care. Enjoy the conversation with Ken Liu. Hello, Ken. How you doing?
Hi, Puneet. How are you?
I'm doing great. Great to see you on the show right off the bat. Thank you so much for taking the time to be able to have a conversation. I'm really excited to dive into a number of different questions and topics with you, and maybe we can go from there.
Same here. Yeah, I'm super excited to have this conversation. Should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. So maybe as a starting point, in order for listeners to get a little bit of an understanding of your pretty interesting professional journey, can you share a little bit about everything that led you into becoming a speculative fiction author?
Yeah, I definitely did not have the most typical career path or anything like that. I was an English major in college, but then I also had a huge interest in technology, and I took a lot of technical courses. And so right after college, I worked as a software engineer. And I did that for a number of years, both at large companies, tech companies, and also small startups. But after that, I decided that I wanted to work in the law. So I went to law school, and I actually ended up practicing as a corporate attorney for a number of years. And eventually, because, you know, my interest in tech kept on coming back, and also I wanted a different lifestyle, I went into litigation consulting, where I worked essentially as an expert witness in patent, trade secret, copyright cases. And so I became a sort of a historian of technology, if you will, because that's what a lot of litigation consulting is actually about. It's about understanding the history of a piece of technology and how it came to be what it is, and how people perceive it. Um, and only after that, as of maybe 5 years ago or so, I shifted over to writing full time. I mean, throughout the time I was a software engineer, a lawyer, a litigation consultant, I was also writing and publishing. But it wasn't until 5 years ago or so that the publishing became such a big part of my life that it essentially took over. And I quit my day job, if you will, and became a full time writer. And there's yet another twist, which is these days, I don't actually spend the vast majority of my time writing. The by far the biggest piece of my life right now is teaching my kids, homeschooling my kids.
Very
That
cool.
actually ends up being the most rewarding and fun part of how I spend my day. And I try to squeeze the writing in when I can. And I feel very lucky that I get to do that, that I get to do something that is not really about making a living, if you will, but about being a human being, being a parent. And I enjoy that part immensely. So I'm sort of a professional homeschooler.
Yeah.
Um, and I write on the side, if you will. So that's where I am.
Wow. So lots to unpack there. If you don't mind me asking about the homeschooling question and around that parenting piece, I'm a parent as well. I have two young boys, 1.5 and 3. And I never initially thought very much about kind of educational plan or what sort of values or thinking specifically I was going to have and want to impart to them. Was that piece around being more directly involved in their education, was that something you knew you wanted to be doing all along, or something that kind of emerged as a result of, your own exposure to education today?
Oh, I wouldn't say anything that I do or participate in is something that I've thought about forever. I mean, people change and
Yeah.
people evolve, and I would say that that's definitely true of myself. I mean, the way we got into homeschooling was my wife was actually the original person to propose it, and I didn't really think deeply about it either way. But once we started, over time, I became more and more involved and more interested. It evolved very organically as part of my thinking about sustainability and about the role of institutions in our lives. I mean, I do think that in modernity, we have a relentless drive to. Um, I don't want to, say this in a way that can be misinterpreted, but I do think that in modernity, we have a very strong drive to standardize things, to, in some ways, turn people from individuals into components that will fit inside this larger machine, whether you want to call it capitalism or whatever. But there's this distrust in doing things on your own. There's a
Hmm.
strong distrust of people doing things on your own. I mean, there are some countries that make homeschooling virtually impossible.
Hmm.
We're sort of lucky that in the US, there's a very strong traditional history of um, pushing and allowing individuals to have that kind of space. I did not like the idea of not spending a lot of time with my kids. I didn't like the idea of um, putting myself in a position where I'm involved in their education and in their growing engagement with the world only tangentially. I didn't want to do that. And my wife and I made the decision to um, try to homeschool and try to spend more time with the kids in a way
Hmm.
that I think, we're lucky that we get to do it. And I
Yeah.
feel like because we can do it, it's really something wonderful that we've decided to do. No problem with the school system or whatever, but I just feel very blessed that I get to spend this extra time with the kids and to be able to say, this is something that we did individually. This is something that we are engaging with individually. This is something that we're trying to come to terms with, to understand, to find our own way. Um,
Mhm.
and I find that very, very valuable.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and we could probably have a whole conversation just around homeschooling and why it's increasing in interest and popularity today for so many reasons. But I think you mentioned something there that's really interesting, which is this idea of we tend to in modern society, in particular Western society, discourage this idea of departing from sort of the mean,
Hmm.
and so much of that has to do with post industrialized world and the need for people to fit into those roles. And what's really interesting is obviously as the machine itself changes, it leaves people in a place of inherent discomfort, which is where do I now fit into the newly configured machine?
Yeah,
And I think probably for those reasons, many of us choose to take different approaches to how we prepare our own children for that world, right?
I think so. I think that's a general trend. This discomfort with the general push to turn humans, individuals, into commoditized packages of skills to be deployed anywhere in this great machine we call the economy. I mean, I find it disturbing, for instance, that a lot of times when we speak about systemic poverty or persistent generational poverty, a lot of times the answer we try to give is, well, people should just leave. People should leave where they're born and then go somewhere else to find jobs, which to me is very weird. This idea that having roots, being humans, having ties to your community is sort of dismissed as without value because it's not measurable as part of the GDP, and that being
Mhm.
productive in the system is somehow the only goal that matters, which is very strange.
Yeah.
It's also very odd that we speak about, there are a lot of problems with our school system. There are a lot of problems with our higher education, but the most salient critiques, the most prominent critiques are all focused on how our schools and our institutions of higher learning are not preparing students to make money, that we're not making
Yeah.
them into productive workers, which is to me is the least interesting and least compelling critique. Why should schools have their job turning out corporate workers? How is that actually a goal? Like,
Yeah.
people speak about this without irony. And when you talk about higher education, the relentless push is, does the degree you earn end up giving you more money? Why is that an interesting thing? That is not the goal of degrees at all. It's very weird to think that
Yeah.
that's what colleges should think about or how students should think about. It's incredibly weird.
Yeah.
And we act like this is okay. It's not okay.
Yeah. It's very interesting because the very first guest that I had on this podcast, Julian Bleeker, who's the CEO of the Near Future Laboratory in LA, one of the clear points that he made was almost identical, which was that you know we see the role of higher education as being something that prepares you for a job, and that the measurement is on the basis purely of alignment with the job, as opposed to learning or having a skill or being able to kind of contribute on a more abstracted level from purely a job.
Or
And
even just even in more selfish ways, being a happier human being, or just
yeah,
being figuring out what your purpose is,
yeah,
something like that. Those seem to me all very valid goals of education. In fact, they were the kind of goals espoused throughout the Western intellectual tradition. I mean, you can go back to Socrates, and the idea of being a better human is the goal of
mhm.
education. We seem to have drifted away from that.
Yeah, there's so many parallels in this conversation to the institution of healthcare, right? And it is very much obviously an institution with a lot of legacy, a lot of tradition. It served such an immense purpose and continues to serve such an important purpose that we rely on. But at the same time, there's this lack of configuration with the reality of how information has changed, the inability for a single human being to process that type of information, and also the realization that you know health information, any information, is now ubiquitously available, right? So that and no one's going to be more engaged with the outcome of their own health than people and their family members. Yet we still have this tradition of healthcare is something that happens to you
Hmm.
and will selectively let you into don't worry about the details. This is normal. That's normal. And it doesn't come from a place of negative intent on the part of healthcare providers, but it is a cultural relic of the fact that people aren't seen as capable of being able to manage their own health, and thus it's not part of the institution's function.
That's right. It's a form of paternalism, and we see that in other aspects too. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with paternalism. It's just it's not always the right answer either. It's a difficult question to figure out what is the point of the healthcare system and how should individuals engage with it so that they feel as agents and in control and
Yeah.
also you have good outcome.
Yeah. So going back to something you said earlier about your meandering journey, I wanted to kind of double click on that a little bit in terms of my own. In Actually, this is something I don't think I've ever shared publicly with anyone, but as a young child, if you were to ask me, what I wanted to do or be when I grew up, after the answer of being a Ghostbuster, the answer was actually to be an author. This was like when I was early in elementary school, and I was in this kind of creative writing program, and I wrote these little stories about human civilizations on Mars. And I look, I went through medical school. I then had my own meandering path going into entrepreneurship and technology. And when I look back, I recently came across, a box of those stories, and I said, "Wow, I don't know if I could even produce that type of writing anymore in terms of that truly creative, free thinking that I had before." And in so many ways, I feel like
for lack of a better word, it's kind of been beat out of me. Writing to me is now this like this technical activity as opposed to something where I'm really exploring like a feeling or exploring something. So, um, kind of sharing that anecdotally, I wanted to ask that the meandering of your path, was that in pursuit of something, do you feel, or was it more in relation to boredom, dissatisfaction with a role or something that you previously thought was captivating, but then you realized it was different? Like, what were the reasons that led to that meandering?
This is a beautiful question, and very, very difficult to answer because the temptation in our society is to come up with a story that makes sense, that allows the meandering to seem purposeful, right? I think that's the temptation. I think our society has a strong expectation and a strong uh, preference for people doing things with a purpose, for the idea that you know what you want. You might have taken a winding path to get to it, but you're getting to what you always wanted. I'm not sure that's always accurate. I think I study stories and I create stories, and I'm very interested in this tendency for us to narrate our own life story, to construct plot and a kind of a character arc for ourselves so that everything fits, so that in retrospect, everything we've done fits into a particular pattern. I think that's very beautiful, but I also don't necessarily think that's true to the experience of the moment. For me, I think things are very random, and the path my life took was very fortuitous. I can say that there are certain constants, which is this feeling that we are here put on earth because we're supposed to search for some purpose, to do something that we're meant to do. I do think that it's very important in life to have a sense, this feeling that you are doing what you're supposed to do, and you have to figure out what that is. um and it turns out that I was good at many things, and I was, I wanted to be a mathematician. I wanted to continue working in technology. I loved actually working with machines, and working in software. That was truly joyful. I loved crafting things out of symbols and making
Mhm,
them do what I wanted to do. Turns out that being a lawyer was very similar. You are also crafting things out of symbols, and trying
mhm,
to create artifacts that work in rule systems, and lead to results you want. And honestly, writing fiction is not particularly different. You're again trying to work with the system known as language and trying to use it to achieve particular effects that to you are satisfying. And so I could say that throughout my career, even though I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I was really just trying different ways of telling stories, if you will. I was trying
mhm,
to, I mean, it didn't seem like that at the time, but in retrospect, that seems to be a pretty good explanation for what happened.
mhm,
I jumped from different things because I wanted to try different ways of telling stories. And because I feel like that's how human beings are wired. We're wired to tell stories, to try to encounter this sequence of random events in the universe and trying to make sense out of it somehow,
mhm,
impose some sort of order on it. And that's what happened to me. I was trying these different things. They're all very random. I couldn't really tell you that there was a plan in terms of me getting to do this versus that. But I just jumped from different things, trying to figure out what fit. And ultimately, I feel like, if there's any lesson to be sort of drawn from my life, it's just this, which is it you should try to do the thing that makes you most excited. And
mhm,
you should just try to do that. This is slightly different from the usual advice of trying to follow your passions. I know that a lot of people say that's terrible advice because, you know, following your passions means that you end up with a degree, I don't know, art history or something, and you can't find a job. But I feel like that's
mhm,
actually a very bad way of looking at it.
mhm,
Following your passion does not mean getting a degree that has
mhm,
the name of whatever it is you're passionate about. That's not what it means. To me, following your passion means literally just doing the thing that you're passionate about and trying to do the thing that you're most excited about, whatever it
mhm,
is. And the important thing here is you do that. And at the same time, you also put some effort into figuring out how to get people to pay you for that. how do you explain the value of what you're doing to people so that you can be
Mhm.
paid for that? That to me is the key. So do the thing that makes you most excited, but also devote some energy to how to convince people to pay you for that thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
So for example, right, I'm a writer and writers don't get paid a lot. A few of us are very
Mhm.
lucky and we end up writing books that a lot of people want. But that doesn't mean that I can't turn the storytelling skill into some way of value to other people. I mean, for example, I work as a futurist. So a lot of what I do is I talk to entrepreneurs and technologists about the importance of storytelling, of how
Mhm.
storytelling is the way that people get excited about your vision. So by showing people, talking to people, and telling people how they can use storytelling as part of their technical work as a way to present their vision in a compelling way to those who need to hear it, I'm offering something of value and I get paid for that.
Mhm.
So that's another way you can do it. You do the thing that you're excited about, you develop an expertise, and then you figure out some way of converting that value into money if that's what you care about. You don't
Mhm.
need a lot, enough so that you can keep on doing the thing that you're excited about. That's what
Yeah.
matters.
So diving into that a little bit more, actually, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on cultural practices, cultural preferences, and ideas around this idea of following your passion. So, my ethnic background is South Asian. My parents are from India, and stereotypically, this idea of following your passion is not necessarily in keeping with what's bestowed on us culturally. And if I understand correctly, your ethnic background is China, and my assumption is that there's a similar pattern there as well. That usually people don't say, "Well, follow your passion is not what you get from your parents," right?
No, it's
Um,
not. Yeah.
so is that something that you feel like you were born with? Was that something that was that more of a family value? Where did that
I would
cultivate?
say, yeah, I would say that it's more of a thing that I discovered over time, and then I think largely the issue here is following your passion is just misunderstood, right? So once again, this goes back to my bigger theme, which is you shouldn't just follow the vocabulary that's already there. You should try to think of your own words. So slightly tangential point here. When you say, right, when we say follow your
Mhm.
passion, there's a tendency to have a very stereotypical image of what that means. So if your passion is to be an actor, let's say, then there's a
Mhm.
stereotypical vision of what that means. There's only one way to be an actor. Um, but why does that have to be the the vision? Like your passion is not necessarily to be an actor. Your passion is to perform, to embody, to create characters, perhaps. In the same way that, my passion is not necessarily to be a professional writer. It's to figure out what stories are and to work with storytelling, right? So
Mhm.
I think a lot of times when people try to explain what their passions are, they try to fit it into existing boxes and existing jobs, if you will. Because
Mhm.
we're dominated so much by the language of economics and thinking in terms of economy, we tend to think that we have to play certain roles, that the only roles available are the ones that are already out there. We tend to not look
Mhm.
deeper. And what I'm advocating is you look deeper into what your passion actually is. So, for example, your passion is not to be a software engineer. Your passion may well be to make products that are interesting,
Mhm.
or your passion is not to be a tech worker in the economy. Your passion actually is to figure out how to use this language of code to do interesting things. Like that's a
Mhm.
much more productive framing. Think about what actually your passion is and then figure out how to craft for yourself a role that would make sense. Again, like I said, my passion was about storytelling. So the role is not to be an author. The role is to figure out what can I do with this interest and these set of skills that are valuable to people, so that I
Mhm.
get to do what I want to do. And I guess this is a fairly important point to me because I really feel like this is more relevant for us than the traditional language of jobs. There's a huge
Yep.
amount of panic about, AI will take over the software industry, so there will be no more need for the traditional programmer, technical workers. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But stop thinking of this in terms of jobs. What are your actual skills and interests? What are the things you actually want to do? Are there ways to do those things once the job is gone? That to me is a much more
Mhm.
interesting thing. And this is relevant for artists, for lawyers, for all kinds of professions where the thing you're interested in is not necessarily just what happens. The job is no more than the particular economic niche that at this moment employs those skills. You can use those
Mhm.
skills and passions to create other jobs and other interesting roles for yourself. This is
Yeah.
related to my larger point, which is about writing and art. And this is, this is a point worth talking about. I really think that um, authors are fundamentally inventors. They're artists and authors tend to be people. If they're excited about something, it's because they have seen something that no one else has seen. They have been able to delve deep into the collective unconscious in some way to emerge with a vision, a particular interpretation of reality that no one else has given. And then it's their job to invent a language, a grammar, an art form, a style to embody that vision that no one else has done. So that
Mhm.
necessitates the idea of inventing new words, inventing new forms of expression, inventing new techniques. That's what originality is. You actually have to invent something. So I feel like this can be applied to everybody. Every job in some way is like that. Every role is like that. You don't just do what's already being established. You have to invent your own job in the same way that an artist has to invent their own style and an author has to invent their own
Mhm.
language to tell the stories that they want to tell. And I think that's true
Mhm.
for everybody. You have to invent your own role to live the life you want to live.
Yeah, and I definitely resonate with that, and I'm trying to think of the parallels to that with some of the anxiety in the healthcare community amongst healthcare professionals and their role. We obviously understand that artificial intelligence is demonstrating the computing capability and the capacity to be able to mimic many parts of human intelligence, including and of course the ability to do clinical reasoning and assist with diagnosis and treatment and management. And it's actually, a great application for artificial intelligence. Perhaps for much of it, you don't even need artificial intelligence as we have it today. But the fear that comes up is that people talk about the idea of, okay, uh, AI is going to take part of our jobs, or perhaps the part of our jobs that we were supposed to protect and be good at. Um, and one of the things that I find really a big challenge I see is that the institutions that build and train healthcare providers, whether it's schools of nursing, schools of pharmacy, schools of medicine, they don't necessarily seem equipped or capable of being able to drive the agility and thinking that's needed to say, what is the value that we can bring to the table today or tomorrow? And therefore, how can we quickly reconfigure the definition of this role? And that conversation I don't ever really see happening that extent. Sure, certainly comes into, okay, how we're going to learn how to use these tools. But that to me is very different from fundamentally asking, yourself, what is the role of a human being when much of the thinking part that we were dependent on humans for may not be the main value proposition that humans are bringing to the table. What are your thoughts about that?
You put that so well. I mean, that was a great way to explain what I was trying to explain. But you did it much better than what I was trying to say.
I'm not sure about that.
I feel like that's a conversation we need to have in every profession. It's difficult because we would like to just keep on doing what we're doing because not having to do a lot of thinking about where is it that we're adding value. This conversation does not generate more money in the GDP. So we don't like to have those conversations, but we need to. I do feel like we need to refocus on the idea of meaning and purpose and value, and not just in terms of dollars and cents. That's not actually interesting at all. The real question is, why are doctors doctors? Why are programmers programmers? Why are lawyers lawyers? What is it that they're actually trying to do, and where are they bringing meaning into what they do, and where are they adding value to the experience of the clients or patients and so on? This is an incredibly important question. And I feel like having that conversation, figuring out what we're really trying to accomplish, you have to know why you're doing something before you can figure out how best to do it. So I feel like you have to have these conversations before you can figure out an optimized way of delivering, of achieving the results that you want. Unless you know where you're trying to go, how can you get there? And I do feel like this is one of those things we need to spend more energy on. And this is definitely not limited to the healthcare industry, even though that is definitely one area where we seem to do the least amount of reflection.
Mhm. Yeah, and actually, you pretty much called out like the MO of this particular podcast, which is how do we build something better if we don't know where we're going? And you're absolutely right. We don't. Um, there's not really a space to be able to do that right now in the work of the traditional institutions in healthcare. But kind of connecting to one of your recent works, and this was actually a short story of yours that it was mechanism by which I was introduced to your writing and your work, and I'm so happy about that. And it was called Good Stories. And one of the themes that you touch on in this work is around this idea of human value and our perception of human value and human creation, uh, with the key point being the human being the creator. And the main character, Clara, has this, who's an author, has this insistence on the idea that people want human written stories. And when I read that, I was obviously thinking in parallel, do we cling on to the idea that we want humans to deliver healthcare to us? And perhaps even the areas of healthcare that we consider to be the most sensitive to requiring humans. And a perfect example of that is empathy. Um, so before we dive a little bit deeper into empathy, what are your thoughts about that? Do you feel like there is a parallel between those two ideas in the context of the author, in the context of how we see humans in medicine?
100%. So let me try to tease this idea apart a little bit about, do we care about stories being from humans or not? Um, I posit that this is one of those questions that has no single size fits all answer. And the answer is it depends, right? When we say stories, we care about stories being about humans or being invented, being written by humans. We mean that only in certain cases, and it differs from different people. So, for example, um, I think everybody knows that there are certain books where they care a lot about the fact that it's written by a human and by an individual who has a particular view, as I said earlier, who has dived into the collective unconscious and emerged with a particular vision that has not been articulated before about reality and interpretation of reality.
Mhm.
That kind of thing, I want that to be a human because I want it to be meaningful. I want it to be purposeful. I want it to be something that allows me to say, this is another human being who has been able to draw upon their own experience to emerge with this new articulation of what the universe means. That's powerful. That's something that I want to experience. And it matters to me that it comes from another consciousness, not random, not statistics, not just um, rearranging data in a way to imitate the semblance uh, of thinking, but actually somebody who suffered and who has a real experience with the universe and came out with this thing. Okay, there are cases like that. There are other stories where I don't care it's written by a machine, and I think that's true for a lot of us. So, for example, does any of us really care if advertisement, a commercial, its screenplay was written by a machine? Do you really care that your latest insurance commercial was written by a machine? I submit that the vast majority of us do not, because in those
Yeah.
cases, the point of the story is not to articulate a new vision of what the universe means. It's to sell you more insurance. If a machine
Mm.
does that, I'm not sure a lot of people care. And
Mm.
there are things all the way in between. So here's the irony of it, of course, which is, um, I would submit that writers of commercial scripts are paid a lot more than writers of obscure novels.
Yeah.
Economically, the kind of words where we don't care whether it's written by a human are far more valuable than the kind of words where we do care it being written by a human. Another example of valuable words that we don't care about being written by a human would be propaganda. I don't think a lot of us would particularly care if the propaganda was generated by a machine. And I would say that in those cases, if if those kinds of creativity, writings, forms of art, design that are intended to send out a corporate or political message of some sort, political in the shallow sense, not in the deep philosophical sense, political in the
Mhm.
I'm just trying to achieve a result here, and manipulate you into some result. That kind of writing and that kind of art, that kind of creativity, we don't think it matters that much, even though they're incredibly valuable. The fact that a machine can be eventually optimized to do that sort of thing is not really a threat for us in the
Mhm.
deep sense. It's a threat to people whose livelihoods depend on that. But I would argue that
Mhm.
most of us view that kind of threat as not really at the same level as about protecting human dignity and protecting or even valuing the idea of what it means to be a human being. There is a contrast between the way the economy values creativity versus how we value creativity independent of money, right? So
Mhm.
I guess my point here is there are some stories where we care deeply that it's done by a human, and some stories where we don't care it's done by a human. And it just happens that it the way we value these things in terms of money is very different from how we value them in terms of emotions and passion
Mhm.
and reasoning. I think there are parallels to be drawn in terms of other human qualities. Are there contexts in which actual real empathy is what we demand versus contexts in which a simulacrum of empathy, a machine generated version of empathy, politeness, what have you, is sufficient, where we don't actually care
Mhm.
that a human cares about us. All we want to know
Mhm.
is we're treated gently and we're not that the empathy is, you know, shown by a machine or by the designer of the machine is enough for us. And we
Mhm.
don't actually need a real human there. I think that's a really interesting, valuable question and something that we should go deeper into. Because just as talking about human creativity being valuable is too broad, there are cases where we care and the cases we don't. I feel like empathy is the same. There are cases where we
Yeah.
care and cases where we don't.
Yeah. Actually, and I can think of a few of those right off the bat. The amount of empathy I might need if somebody was to tell me I have influenza or I have a upper respiratory tract infection might be different from the empathy I might need if someone's telling me, I have some type of a terminal diagnosis. But the one thing that I try to wrap my head around is the extent to which we overrate or perhaps inappropriately assign an incredible amount of value to the human being the executor of that, or perhaps even the capacity for a human being able to consistently deliver that, right? And understandably, humans are humans. We'll have good days and bad days. But for each individual person, like let's say it's an oncologist and who's actually fantastic at their job. So let's actually assume that at baseline, they have fantastic emotional intelligence and they're excellent at empathic communication. They might have something happen, the night before, their child is sick, they're going through a relationship difficulty, and they might be performing at 50% or 25% of their usual capacity. But to the receiving person who is now for the first time being told that, you have lung cancer and you only have weeks left, that makes no difference, right? And they might not even understand that that's actually impacting that like, particular oncologist. So does that, how does that interplay with the need for people who are vulnerable to receive what they need when, I guess, perhaps the utilitarian argument could be that if we could perfect the act of empathic mimicry, and we could deliver it at cents on the dollar 24/7, that it would make more sense to make that available than the, you know, haphazard ability for humans. And and again, we're in this particular example, I'm making the assumption that the clinician actually has an incredible empathic capability. We all know that human beings being human and there being a spectrum, many of us have honestly had interactions with the healthcare system where we don't feel any empathy at all, even those humans. In fact, that can be damaging and probably even more hurtful. So yeah, so how do we interplay with the fact that we protect this idea of the human being the the vehicle of delivery for something, where we ourselves know that rationally it's not possible for that to be scaled or that to be consistently made available to people.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And then I think I would distinguish between the performance or the appearance of empathy versus the deep soul, if you will, of empathy. And I'll try to illustrate this
Mhm.
with an example from my own experience. So I don't know much about how doctors do their work, but I do know quite a bit about how lawyers do their work. And this
Mhm.
is something that was hugely impactful for me as a result of my clerkship. One of the things that I had to do as a lawyer was, I clerked for a federal judge, and part of my job was to help the judge review these appeals from immigration asylum hearings, essentially. Um, and there are a large number of these cases. They fall into certain patterns, and they're basically about people telling a story and whether the judge believes the story or not. It's a matter of credibility. That's so much of the law
Mhm.
depends on that sort of thing. And I didn't know how to handle these cases on review originally, and it's the judge, my clerk for, who showed me how important it is that even though these cases, there are so many of them and they're so routine in some ways, you still have to give it your best care and to treat every single one as though it were the only case to come across your table that day, because um, these are real people's lives that are dependent on here. The lawyers, arguing below may be incredibly busy. They have terrible caseloads. They barely have 20 minutes to even talk with their client. They're representing these clients on the basis of the smallest amount of knowledge they can have, and they're going to make mistakes. There will be
Mhm.
errors, and it's our job at the appellate level as the last shot to catch these mistakes. We are there to
Mhm.
to give it our best shot to allow these individuals, these individuals, they're not just statistics, they're individuals, to have a chance to have their
Mhm.
story be heard and to be understood in the most empathetic way possible, and to see if a mistake has been made in the denial of their application, and so on and so forth. And that made a huge impact on me. The importance of empathy here is not just to make you feel like something was done, but to actually give you the results of something being done. A human being
Mhm.
tried their best to give you
Yep.
their attention and to use their professional judgment to solve your problem. This is what they tried to do. The system may be such that nothing can be done, but somebody tried. Somebody really worked on it. And that's different from mere the simulation, the pretense of somebody trying and having nobody
Mhm.
doing it. I think in terms of medical care, we need to also distinguish between the simulation of empathy versus the real practice of it. So I'll give you, a contrasting example. One version has a trained doctor reviewing every single set of test results, because the idea is you just have to have a human do it because machines will not give you empathy. So a human has to do it. So the human is overworked and unable to give the necessary amount of attention to each single test.
Mhm.
The other alternative is to have machines do the filtering. Machines will do it, and machines will be set in such a way that it will generate a large number of false positives, but it will be sure not to miss any. And then the human is to review all of these results to make sure that the false positives are, false, and so we don't generate bad results. Or alternatively, we can have the machine uh, run such a way that nothing is missed, because if you have a human do the review, humans get tired
Mhm.
and they'll miss something. The machines never will. You have a human
Mhm.
do the selective reviewing of these unusual cases to be able to say, okay, I'm giving the attention to these cases. And so in one case, you can say there was more so-called empathy because a human was doing all the work. But the reality is that's actually less empathy, because the places where you really need that human to step in and say, hey, this is what needs to be done is missed. Whereas in the other case, you have machines compensating for human frailty by making sure that nothing is missed, is actually more empathetic fundamentally. Because even though the human doctor may not have reviewed every single set of results, the human doctor reviewed all the results that needed to be reviewed. And that matters. And I think that's actually a better result, more empathy than the other way around.
100%. And, I have an interesting example from my own early years emerging as a clinician. There's words that people will say to you that kind of stick in your mind. And I think, I remember an experience where I was working with a particular specialist, and they were talking about tips and tricks on how to practice medicine. And one of the things they said was, yeah, always make sure to remember, one detail about the person's life, like a name of their dog or a hobby, so that they think you care. And I'll never forget them saying that. And, the feeling that left me with, in terms of, like, especially as somebody coming into the profession, it really cast this this very different light on what was happening. And it made you realize that there was a dissonance between what we were trying to build in a healthcare system and sort of what we've resulted with. Obviously, this was just like one particular example, but it speaks to the fact that when we industrialize and we overwork, we actually drive out the human elements, of the thing that very much requires those human elements.
Yeah, you're 100% right.
Um,
To draw an analogy here again, the way we talk about empathy is often like the way we talk about creativity, as I mentioned, where
Mhm.
we use one word to mean very different things, and some of which we care about and some which we don't. I mean, creativity used in the service of executing a precise corporate message, to me, is
Mhm.
not at all the same thing as creativity executed in service of trying to articulate a new vision of what the human condition is. I have my own biases. My bias is I find the first kind not as valuable as the second kind. And I,
Mhm.
I find that our insistence on protecting the first kind of creativity without at all even thinking about the second kind to be deeply flawed. We shouldn't be focusing so much on protecting jobs. We should be focusing on what is human creativity being deployed in ways that are most
Mhm.
meaningful for humans. Analogously, when we're talking about empathy, I feel like a lot of times when we talk about empathy, we sort of talk about it as, again, a matter of economics, not necessarily as a matter of what is this empathy actually about? What is it? What is the result we're trying to achieve? I know, for example, that there are studies about how doctors who are perceived as more empathetic are sued less. And this is often explained or described or sort of talked about as a reason for medical students to care about it, because,
Mhm.
it's it's not for some other reason, but just the reason of professional liability. You should try to be more
Yeah.
so that you get sued less, which to me is understandable, but not really the right way to look at it. Empathy is not instrumental. It's not there
Mhm.
to do this result, to achieve this result. It's there because it's an important part of what the ultimate goal of the healthcare system actually is. Is empathy, as I described earlier in that example, being systemically added um, to the way we practice medicine so that we achieve better results for all patients, as opposed to this very narrow-minded vision of the simulation of empathy.
I I want to dive a little bit deeper into this point, and you said something really interesting, which was this kind of distinction between the simulacrum of empathy versus sort of the soul of empathy from the perspective of when humans are able to genuinely communicate that. And as somebody who's a futurist and from a technology background, you're completely inundated with examples of technology right now. Let's say, for example, Suno, which you might know, which produces obviously songs as an AI platform that mimic human writing and song making. put in a prompt and you get this really incredible output. And I mean, when we think about the advance in the ability for technology to get closer and closer and chip away at those discrete differences between, okay, I can just feel that this is still artificial because it lacks soul. Because let's say I know or I don't know that a human was or wasn't involved
Mhm.
in making it, but we're going to increasingly move towards a space where we're blurring that line and that difference. And arguably, perhaps, I'm looking at it from one perspective, we might achieve this place of mathematical perfection where we get so good at simulating it that it's arguably even better than the result
Sure.
that a human being could produce. And biochemically, it produces that same feeling, or perhaps even I talk about this concept of this feeling of like super empathy
Mhm.
or superhuman empathy, where it just, wow, you didn't just make me feel better, you made me feel extraordinarily better just by the words that you said and your ability to understand me. Do you think that it it's possible through technology that we get to a place where we actually exceed some of those domains that we still consider part of the soul of the human being?
This is
Or do you think that, yeah, or
Yeah, this
philosophically,
is
that's
this is a really
this we can't touch?
interesting question, and I guess my answer is twofold. One is I don't believe those results are achievable so long as AI is premised on the imitation game and
Mhm,
is constructed as a matter of optimization based on example inputs. The reason I say that is, you know, this is this is a really old philosophical point, but you can no more produce a master artist by training the artist only on other forms of works of art. Like artists have to actually go experience the world. As I said, they need to go delve deep into the collective unconscious before they can produce genuinely new forms of art. If all their input just consists of other forms, works of art, I don't think, I mean, based on the human experience, it's not possible to really become a great artist by merely absorbing other examples, which is how we're sort of training AI right now. All the AI we have is just being trained on examples of desired output, as opposed to being put into a position where they're experienced in the universe. I mean, I don't remember who said this, but I do feel like in order for AI to break out of its current plateau, if you will, of just imitating, and creating things that are great imitations of what already exists, they have to actually live real lives in some sense. They have to actually experience the universe in some deep sense, whatever that means. But you cannot, a language model knows the universe only through language, but humans don't do that. And I think any kind of real intelligence cannot do that. You cannot know the universe
mhm,
only through these representations, interpretations, and works produced by other intelligences. So that's point one. Point two, assuming we keep on advancing technology and actually produce AI that is modeled along the ways I'm talking about, meaning they're embodied, they are experiential, they actually have some kind of experience engagement with the universe, such that they now come up with things that are, for lack of a better term, original. I think by that
mhm,
point, we will have achieved what would be, I guess, what I would call real artificial intelligence, meaning here is now a consciousness, a cognitive process that I would consider to be a consciousness, an independent
mhm,
sentience that is experiencing universe and coming up with something novel after having delved into the collective unconscious, whatever the equivalent of the human one that is. They're
mhm,
they're structurally different from us. They are evolutionarily different. Obviously, they are modeled on us in some way, but they're not us. So they're going to have a different experience of the universe. At that point,
mhm,
what they're producing does not need to have the soul of the human because they have the soul of the machine. The soul
mhm,
will have emerged at that point, and as a separate actual intelligence with an experience of the universe, whatever it has to say, assuming I can understand it, I will be incredibly interested in that. In the same way I'm interested in another human being's story because,
Mhm.
I use this example all the time, but imagine if an aircraft carrier could write a novel. Aircraft carrier actually has an experience of the universe and wrote a novel about what the universe is like based on that experience. That would be incredibly interesting. I would love to read it in the same way I would love to read a novel written by a whale or by an
Mhm.
elephant. These are all things that I, as a human being, cannot possibly access. And if I, assuming I can somehow understand them, that work of art would be incredible. So in those cases, it's not so much that they need to imitate the soul of the human. There's no imitation needed. They will have their own separate
Mhm.
soul, and it will be just as bright and
Mhm.
valuable.
Mhm. Now, l- looking at it from a slightly different lens, perhaps speaking to the current state of the modern world where we live in a highly consumerist, globalized world in many ways, but also one in which people's interests, preferences, likes to many extents are also manufactured or influenced and controlled by corporate interests. We often hear about the fact that, so hey, this isn't true for every single hit song, but so many hit songs come up in a boardroom where, you look at, what Michael Jackson did and you slow down part of his song, then you mix something else and you produce a hit. And it makes me think about the question of whether, given that we're in the world that we're in now, which is in many ways far more connected, far more consumerist today than 100 years ago. Is it possible for people to lose touch with that true element of humanity where they actually become more influenced by what they think they're supposed to like, and they no longer actually really get to know what do I as an individual like? And this kind of goes back to the whole idea of jobs, and you go into accounting to be an accountant, and that's because that's what you're supposed to do,
Mhm.
um, and has nothing to do with your own personal interests or passions. So do you feel like we're coming into a world where people can, to a certain extent, be programmed to not be able to understand what they really like and instead become products of a entirely consumerist world?
Well, that's a common fear, and it's something that, science fiction writers have talked about since forever. And, I can't say that that will never happen, but I'm very skeptical about that. So here's why. So I think we underestimate the degree of agency that people have and the degree to which people are actually resistant to manipulation. So let me try to come at this from a slightly different angle. So, oftentimes, when I talk about creativity and why humans care about human stories and so on and so forth, people say, well, what if you didn't know that something was, done by a machine and you reacted to it? Doesn't that prove my point? I'm like, well, you're
Mhm.
talking about deception, and
Mhm.
deception is a totally different kind of category. So, let me give you an example. It is entirely possible for, say, a snail to be dipped in some paint and to run around the canvas and create a bunch of patterns. And you put that up on a museum wall and have people look at it. People will have an aesthetic experience. That does not mean somehow that snails are intelligent or you have proven that art is a fraud. What you have proven, though, is that the aesthetic experience can oftentimes come from the viewer, not be an intentional communication act from the artist. This has
Mhm.
been a very old idea in human society. We contemplate things like bonsai, art, Zen gardens, all
Mhm.
kinds of. We feel an aesthetic experience when we look at the Grand Canyon. Nature draws a kind of aesthetic experience from us. We respond to it. In those cases, I would argue that the art, the aesthetic experience, is almost entirely supplied by the viewer. But this is not
Mhm.
particularly different from any kind of aesthetic experience. When you're looking at a painting or reading a story and you're engaging with it, you are engaging. You are also supplying half, at least half, if not more, of the aesthetic experience. It's just that it happens that in the other half, there's crafted thing by the artist. I think that sometimes the most valuable experiences are when an artist tries to communicate a unique new vision of the universe and you perceive it as a viewer. But it's also possible for you to perceive randomness and out of that randomness perceive your own new interpretation of the universe as you would with a
Mhm.
piece of AI created art. So in those cases, I don't think you've proven anything about the lack of artistry or art in the world. You've simply proven that half the time the aesthetic experience comes from the viewer. And that doesn't invalidate artists. That just shows that we humans can derive artistic pleasure from other
Mhm.
things than crafted artworks. So that's point one. Point two about what you said here. Um, I think um, humans are much more resistant to manipulation and to the kind of overt crafting that you're talking about because it has always been in our nature to try to seek meaning on our own terms. You can tell people what things mean. I mean, that's what organized religions do, right? But
Mhm.
we have never had a situation where everybody submits to one set of ideas. Any totalitarian
Mhm.
ideology, no matter how much they push, they have never been able to stamp out resistance, rebels, those who just will not submit. Um, and technology, even though it is such a powerful force for conformity, for pushing messages out, it's also very powerful in terms of preserving that kind of individual space and connecting like-minded individuals with each other so that they can feel the strength of resistance in their numbers. Uh, we've seen this. Internet was supposed to provide a global culture of conformity in a lot of ways, and it does. And yet, at the same time, has also facilitated a flourishing of minority viewpoints, resistance viewpoints that are not willing to be dominated. And the any technology that facilitates communication and messaging will also facilitate counter messaging and organization for resistance. So I'm not so pessimistic about this. I really don't think that. I mean, to give you another example of AI, right? So I actually think one of the more useful, interesting, and intriguing possibilities of AI is AI used to promote um, more individualistic and particular tastes. So, for example, right now, the way we market books or music or movies, whatever, it's always based on the idea of if something's popular, then you will probably like it. So it's always
Yeah.
when the rich get richer kind of effect. And
Yeah.
the long tail has become more and more flat. But AI can reverse that. If you train AI on your own taste and set the AI to go out there to find things for you, AI is no longer required to just recommend you the most popular thing. It can go out and
Mhm.
find the one special thing published 5 years ago that has 2 reviews, which is perfect for your taste, assuming somehow we can, in fact,
Mhm.
code your taste into the AI. In that case, you will be reading this thing that no one else is reading, or very few other people are reading. You're not reading bestsellers. You're reading the thing that suits your taste the best. So now we're
Mhm.
pushing for the idea of allowing individuals to assert their taste more, to find things that are perfectly suited to their taste, as opposed to the bestsellers that only approximately fit their taste. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's the potential for AI and technology to actually promote um, the kind of individuality that we seem to be
Mhm.
losing in this age of heavy advertising and ubiquitous commercialization. I'm
Yeah.
optimistic. I don't believe that the technology will only push in one direction.
Yeah, that really reminds me of a talk that I recently heard by Jack Conti. I might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but he's the CEO and founder of Patreon. He did this talk at South by Southwest, and he said it was titled "The Death of the Follower." And he spoke about the fact that, ever since algorithms and social media have changed to downregulate your content being seen by people who specifically, follow you or are interested in your content, and instead put in content that they think will grab your attention, it's created obviously a changing effect in terms of people becoming distant from the people that they were originally interested in. You can't actually even find the material, and instead, you're simply just recommended
Mhm.
everything, right? On the basis of quote unquote the algorithm. TikTok behaves that way, and Instagram Reels, and all of that. And he interestingly also spoke about this fact that on the optimistic side, you can see AI being reconfigured to actually be able to not give more focus on attention but rather on
Hmm.
interest. So because attention can be subject to shock, awe, sadness, like certain experiences that you may or may not want to have, but you're almost imposed onto you. Whereas your specific likening, interest, kind of community is a distinctly different thing. And if we value that over simply quote unquote attention, then it changes the balance of what people see. So I see a lot of parallels between
Yeah,
those points.
absolutely, absolutely.
So, in the interest of time, I kind of want to circle back a little bit to your thoughts on healthcare. And I know it's not fair for me to say, where do you see the healthcare system going in the next 3 to 5 years? Although feel free to comment on that if you feel like you have an answer. But um, I'd love to hear your thoughts, from your vantage point. Given what we've discussed, creativity, humanity, empathy, what does good look like in a healthcare system in the not so distant, AI driven future?
I mean, I feel that, one particular viewpoint, one particular pain point right now in the healthcare system is um, the fact that we are so interventionist and we devote the vast majority of our resources to these interventionist treatments near the end of life. Those are incredibly expensive, and I don't think they necessarily produce a lot of quality of life. I mean, I see this happening to friends, to family all the time, where the last few years of their life are spent entirely in the hospital or what have you, and it's an incredibly painful experience. What can we do to make that better? I mean, one simpler answer would be to just put more energy into the preventive care side of things, the side about helping people to live healthier lifestyles to prevent us from having the kind of diseases that end up getting us in that position. I mean, there's been a lot of research about the extent to which modernity, increases inflammation, among other things, which, can be the source of a huge number of problems. Um, can technology, can ubiquitous AI, can a general comfort and trust in making use of AI in your daily life help humans live healthier lives? I think that's an open question. I don't know for a fact that it will, but I also don't know for a fact that it will not. But it seems to me worth investigating. I mean, that is part of healthcare and health maintenance, health
Hmm.
promotion. I feel like we can all think about how that may actually help us. Now, that may not end up increasing the bottom line of any particular player in the healthcare industry. So that's a problem. But
Hmm.
surely there are ways for us to figure out a way to pay for it. Again, this is the analogous thing to what I was talking about earlier. We see something here of value, meaning people will live healthier lives. Um, how do we figure out a way to get people to pay for that? How do we figure out a way to
Yeah.
actually support that value in a system that is in fact, market driven? I think that's the real challenge.
Yeah. 100%. Of course, as somebody working in primary care, I'm hugely aware of the immense gap that we have in actually being able to practice preventative health. Sort of the first thing that goes out the window when, from a completely rational perspective, you would think that first and foremost, we want to be doing whatever we can to avoid illness. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And yeah, I'm optimistic as well. I do think that if we're able to create that alignment in terms of the financial system incentives, that there's an opportunity to be able to really revolutionize what preventative care means at the individual level, as opposed to at the level of a guideline or whatever we can do it for a population.
Yeah, and I'm optimistic that we can make it work. I mean, I always go back to the example of smoking, right? I mean, I think if you go back 2 generations, the idea that we would essentially wipe out public smoking and reduce smoking significantly would have seemed impossible. I mean, this is like, you're attacking a lifestyle choice that so many people have made, and all the knowledge out there doesn't seem to change anything. But nonetheless, we have succeeded. I mean, it's not just about, again, knowledge. Knowledge is actually the least part of it. I think oftentimes we fall into this trap thinking that if people just know, they will change their behavior. It's not. It turns out that we had to go through a lot of things. It's a combination of a huge amount of narrative change, cultural change, fashion change in society that ultimately made smoking, at least in the United States, a very unpopular thing among a large part of the
Mhm.
population. And that's a success story.
Yeah.
It shows that we
Yeah.
can, in fact, do the sort of thing that seems otherwise economically very difficult to achieve. We achieved.
Mhm. Fantastic. Any parting remarks? Anything else you wanted to add for the listeners?
Um, Not a whole lot, other than the fact that I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was really fun and it made me think about a lot of things I hadn't thought about before. And I just thank you. That was really, really cool.
No, the pleasure's mine. This was super interesting. I'm looking forward to actually going back and listening to this again and kind of reflecting on these points. And I really think I obviously strongly feel like this serves a purpose for the healthcare system to take a moment of a breather and really think a little bit more deeply about what we're doing and where we want to go. So thank you, Ken, for taking the time to let that happen.
Thank you.